All right. So this is about our future memory project. Also, my collaborator Sitze Wieringa is in the audience. So if any questions, we're both here. So what is the future memory project trying to achieve? It's really about addressing this fundamental question: how are we going to deal with memory of future generations about this critical history of Holocaust and Nazi crimes? And I structured my presentation also very much along the line of the questions that Victoria shared with us. So this is a bit the program, what's involved, what are the considerations, what's the pedagogical principles behind it, how does it feed into specific debates, and what are the ethical issues. But I think there's a more fundamental question that we have to answer first. Why VR? Why any kind of technology, actually? Well, one reason for us is we deal with space. We deal with space across Europe, and very often it's a space that has no markings of its history in any way. So here you have Jasenovac in Croatia, 2019. It's essentially a sculpted landscape, which doesn't tell us very much about the concentration camp that was there. But now we make that space again accessible through augmented reality presentations that we call future memory. And in this case, what we do on the one hand is the reconstruction of the historical landscape to tell visitors what was there by means of very detailed reconstructions, often also very difficult to realize because you don't always have all the information directly available. But then it's not only about reconstructing the space to show people what was there, but the concept is really to use space as a scaffold for learning. And that has a specific reason that I will explain. As you explore space, you will find at specific locations in space, mini exhibitions, if you want, that present you with different aspects of the history of these sites, which might be based on, let's say, an interview with a survivor, as we also previously saw. It might be a fragment from a diary. It might be a historical source. It can be anything you want. But again, it's presented to the user in space to tell you roughly what played out at the location where you're standing. And we make it also accessible through, for instance, these icons that you see displayed in the augmented reality, or in this case, the virtual reality representation of the Falstadt Memorial in the left upper corner. Now here you see another version of this technology. In this case, it's a museum installation at the Bergen-Belsen Memorial, which makes the history of the army barracks, the garrison, accessible, but again, following exactly a similar approach where the user visits space. In this case, it's virtual space, it's reconstructed space, and within that space, they will find specific exhibitions. So this project started about 10 years ago, really looking at the history of the Bergen-Belsen Memorial, empty space, reconstructed space, and again, the historical content projected in that space. And now also we have reached out to many other sites across Europe. But why? Right, so this is what we do, and why would you do it? Well, it deals with a number of challenges that we want to answer. On the one hand, the challenge of the memory crisis, which means we now enter the post-witness era. So how are we going to authenticate the history of the Holocaust and Nazi crimes? And we make a commitment to the historical space by saying it's the historical space that can help us to authenticate history also for future generations. But that, of course, means that we have to deal with the stories that pertain to that space. The second aspect of answering why is, well, whatever we tried so far has not been that effective, right? If you look at the few surveys that were done, we see that the overall understanding and knowledge about Holocaust and Nazi crimes is actually not as good as we would like it to be, which is a challenge, in particular for future generations, when the witnesses are not among us anymore. The second aspect of answering why is also establishing a ground truth, right? So if we, for instance, we look now at the moral anchoring, what are the moral anchoring points in our society? It's also the incomprehensible aspects of our history. if we cannot communicate this in a way that we can relate to it, we lose the anchoring points, or we lose the ground truth that is underlying the collective knowledge in our society. So why now virtual reality? Well, actually, virtual reality is a technology, a means to an end, that helps us to very specifically address how our brain deals with information, how the brain forms memory. And that's actually also my day job, is my work in neuroscience. So what we have learned is essentially that the brain is very much driven in the formation of memory by voluntary action in space, which means that now we can combine that with our wish to elaborate the historical meaning of space. Because actually we also know, by moving in space, by having people search for information in space, we also know we are optimally driving memory formation and experience. So this is not just a hypothesis anymore. This is also really shown by very concrete neurophysiological experiments in humans. So we know space modulates memory. So if you present history in space, we will enhance people's recollection of that. And also we have shown that by many validation experiments of our approach, right? So now I should get out of this and we should move to the next slide. Okay, then there was the question. So here we have historical space that we want to use for authentication. We present stories, the history of that space in situ, because we know this speaks to the way humans form memories optimally. So, but then Victoria's question was what are the technological considerations? Well, oops, now my image doesn't appear, but the technological infrastructure you will need for this representation is, of course, a database environment in which you can store historical information in this multimodal sense with your spatial reconstructions, that then you can again deliver in a comprehensive way to different kind of end user devices. So for us, the core is that infrastructure you got to build, and not whether it comes out on a mobile phone or on a tablet or on a head-mounted display or in any other kind of projection system, right? So you need to deliver an integrated infrastructure that enables you to bring these sources of information together. So what's involved in developing such a VR project about the Holocaust? Well, I seem to have some strange problems here with my graphics, which I apologize for, but maybe, okay, it's unhappy with my graphics. That's no good. So we are following very much the notions of constructivism, going back to Lev Vygotsky, which already told us in the 1930s that if we think about learning, there are two things that we have to keep in mind. Learning always takes place in what he called the proximal zone. That means, given what I know, there's a proximal zone of potential knowledge that I can plausibly enter. And it's very individual. It depends on my experience. And my experience might be different from someone else's experience. So that means a pedagogical consideration that we optimally try to deliver through our VR, AR applications is individualized exploration of that proximal zone. Okay, so this is a fundamental pedagogical concept that drives what we do. And you also know that in the Bergen-Belsen application, we have translated that, working with the educational team at the Bergen-Belsen Memorial, into a structured program where we send the students out on the historical ground with the augmented reality applications. But afterwards, let's turn this off so we have no background noise. But we have faced this experience, right? So they go out on the terrain, they explore freely. So it's individualized. We don't tell them where to go. They are free to explore. So that's the individualized way of exploring the space. But then the third phase is a collective sense making, a collective meaning generation through a dialogue with each other, where they show the things they found interesting, that they have bookmarked in our app. And that's also moderated by one of the education experts, right? So you have a very phased approach to really implement these constructivist ideas about individualized education and exploration of the proximal zone. So what debates do we feed into with respect to the Holocaust? And maybe one important debate that we try to speak to is, okay, what's the purpose of the education, right? On the one hand, we have the sort of the high aspiration of those that do not remember the history will tend to repeat it. On the other hand, the more cynical interpretation of Kurt Vonnegut that says, well, we'll do that anyway, because we're humans. We tend to repeat our history. We try to find this middle ground through this constructivist perspective by saying, well, it's not up to us to set normative objectives of education, what people should or should not be doing. But what we can do is try to really present people with an individualized experience that helps them to gain their or improve their understanding of this history so that they will explore more in the future. So it's not to deliver an educational endpoint, but it's more to set people on a trajectory of future exploration, which we also see confirmed. Now, in terms of ethical questions, there are many, of course, and this is almost an initial collection, but also based on our own experience, which is who owns, in that sense, the Holocaust and Nazi crimes. So, by that I mean, who owns also the historical heritage of this, the commemoration, the source material, the interpretation, who is the channel for communication? I think in the field, there's a lot of confusion about that, because there's a sense that certain fields might have priority in how we have to deal with that. Well, our approach is more to say, well, let's also be humble and admit that we actually have failed so far, and that we still have to start to really have impact on this education. So let's not defend little islands of ownership, but let's really look at large-scale multidisciplinary collaboration to make progress, right? So in that sense, we also say, should we leave it to the historians to inform future generations? Is that enough? Should we leave it to the technologists? And with one app after the other, is that enough? No, it is large-scale multidisciplinary collaboration that we have to look towards, but also with an open debate what the ground truth is we want to teach. For some people, the question even of ground truth is already completely unacceptable. Well, for others,
time with you, Paul.
You said seconds or minutes?
You can, yeah, another minute's fine.
Okay, good. So there are a bunch of core questions we have to look at, but I think at this point in time, we have to step down from our normalizing and also moralizing perspective to believe that there's one perspective that is the right one. We have to come down from that position and really look at, okay, how can we form also a science of this that really looks at the validation of what works? For instance, despite the enormous efforts in conserving, presenting this history across many memorial sites, education programs, the attempts to actually measure how well they work are desperately few. And that's telling us a lot. Was it just assumed that this would work out of the box? I don't think so. Now we pay the price for that. Now we see young generations growing up with a very distorted understanding of this history. It's time to change, and it's very urgent. So these are some of the ethical questions that we are also worried about. So what's our goal? Here we're at the end. Future Memory believes we have to claim the space again for this historical purpose, have to protect the space and not have it turned into building projects and parking lots or just disappear into the forest. We have to reclaim the space. We have to tell the story using this kind of technology that I described to you to make it accessible to the citizen of today and tomorrow. So our goal is connecting 100 sites. By now we have reached 10 in 10 years. So I need a few more years, I guess, to scale. But this is really our ambition, have a critical mass of historical sites across Europe linked together to tell this really fundamental story of our humanity, of Holocaust and Nazi crimes. So thank you very much.